This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Hello, Cardinal fans. Welcome to another episode of the St. Louis Cardinals Unrestricted podcast. This is your host, Christian May Suzuki, and man, this is not a position that I expected to be in at this point. Mike Shildt gone as Cardinal manager. That is not something that I was expecting to say this early on, especially with the contract extension that was reportedly being discussed. This was out of left field, to say the least. Shildt will end his tenure at 451 games, which is the least since Ken Boyer in 1978 to 1980. You know, there's another guy, Jorgensen, who technically served less, but he was serving as an interim, and he replaced Torre in the middle of the season and then was replaced, so that doesn't really count. And then when you look at Cardinal managers with a winning record, he has the least number of games since Marty Marion, who managed one season all the way back in 1951. He finished 81 and 73 with one tie, but finished third in that division and was replaced. So looking at Shildt, he finishes with a record of 252 and 199, but I think it's more the 4-9 postseason record and just the general perception that he was not quite ready to win the big game or to win in the postseason. That was something that was always looming over him, and with the situation that the Cardinals are in, seems like they felt the initiative to really push for a win right now. It is a little bit strange, admittedly, and again, it's a shocking thing, and I'm hearing that basically everyone behind the scenes is similarly shocked, both players, GMs, on multiple teams. So the question is this justified? Is this something that is going to move the Cardinals in the right direction? I think that a lot of people have brought up the records and have shown that Shildt has one of the best records among the modern managers. However, when you take a look at just the first four seasons of Shilt's tenure, of Matheny's tenure, and compare it to Shilt's overall four-season tenure, you see that Matheny finished with a 375 and 273 record, which is a 57%, almost 58% winning percentage, whereas Shildt was at 55.9, so 56%. So actually, through the first 4 years, Matheny was doing much better. And when you look at the postseason records, Matheny didn't make the postseason again after the first four seasons. He was 21 and 22, which isn't great, but he was able to win series, and it is much better than 4 and 9. So all of this is good, all of this is well, and we can speculate all we want about who, what, when, where, and why. The biggest thing is that they were talking an extension not even a week ago, and now he's gone. So the question is, what changed? If it's something that happened over the past few days, we can go back and speculate all we want about, Shildt asking for different pieces in press conferences, or whatever philosophical differences, whatever he said. I think that part of it really is they came to the conclusion that Shildt wasn't going to be the guy to take them over the top. And people were saying, oh, did he get fired over the Reyes decision? I don't think so, but maybe a re-examination of that decision and other decisions that he's made over the course of the season, maybe that was what changed. They sort of realized that the extension was not the right move, and that they decided that they needed to move on, and they needed to move on quickly in order to capture the window that I've been talking about these past few weeks. And, honestly, just since Goldschmidt and Arenado have been on the team. So they decided that it was time to move on because they knew that this wasn't going to be what they needed to get over the top. And so they decided to make that move instead of just letting him carry on next year and then firing him anyway when that decision has already essentially been made. So the question is, why was there such a dramatic difference in tone and vibe and just generally the way it felt between the release of the firing of Matheny and the firing of Shildt? Obviously, when it comes to postseason and just general tenure, Matheny had a little bit more under his belt. He had more postseason accomplishments, and he had a little bit more to talk about in a press release. But when you do look at the different tone between the Matheny release and the Shildt firing, you'll see that there is a significant tonal shift. There is much more positive light, positive view shined on Matheny than on Shildt. And that is very interesting to me because we can talk about winning and losing, big games, we can talk about attendance, we can talk about whatever philosophical differences means. But at the end of the day, he was way better than Mike Matheny, and Matheny didn't exactly leave on the best terms either. He was not particularly well loved by players, and he had really brought the organization down in the eyes of many fans, and he was just not very well liked on his way out. Shildt is a completely different story. There are a lot of people like myself that weren't the biggest fans of his work and weren't necessarily particularly high on him, and do agree that he's not going to be the guy that gets you over the top. But we can, for the most part, agree that he was better than Mike Matheny. And the perception of him is far better than the perception of Mike Matheny on his way out and what he did on his way out. So it might not necessarily relate to the firing or be the reason for the firing as a whole, but something definitely did change over the past week or so, however many days. I don't even know if it was a week. Maybe 4 or 5 days. But this whole philosophical differences and the inability to get into it, I do think is simply them trying to say that, without saying, that they don't believe that Shildt can get them over the top, can get them that big win. And it does remind me of a couple of interesting scenarios. And both of them are NBA situations. And I mentioned this on Twitter recently, but this definitely reminds me a lot, or hopefully reminds me of, when the Warriors fired Mark Jackson in 2014, and when the Toronto Raptors fired Dwayne Casey when he won Coach of the Year in 2018. And these guys were seen as solid coaches. They were guys who had gotten their team to the playoffs. Obviously, Casey had won a Coach of the Year, so he was very well respected, and you know, his performance was good. And these guys were doing well, all things considered. But the ownership looked at the situation and said, no, we want more. This is not the goal. The goal at the end of the day is to win a title. And so they got rid of those guys and hired outside voices, guys who were fresh, who had new ideas, and who introduced something that was new that really put that team over the top. For Steve Kerr, it was the motion offense and the passing and just the way that they Warriors play nowadays. And with Nurse, it was sort of a similar idea, where it was just a different style of play, different set of ideas that came in, and it made things flow better. So the question is now that one part of that equation, the firing of the player-loved, generally well-respected around the league coach, can the St. Louis Cardinals find a Steve Kerr, a Nick Nurse, a Gabe Kapler, a Sean McVay? Question is, will they even look for that? And that's the biggest concern with firing Mike Shildt here. If they're going to simply look inside and go for the two guys that they are looking like they want to go for in Stubby Clapp and Marmol, it's going to be the same deal. These are guys who don't have a lot of major league experience, and while they did well in the minor leagues and they've done well as coaches, they just don't quite have that experience at that level, and their abilities and their ideas and the way they do things might not quite translate all the way over. And again, it's about new ideas. It's about fresh things being introduced and blending the old and the new. And just hiring internally and bringing in guys with the same ideas and nodding their heads at the same things, that is not going to be productive. It's just going to be another Mike Shildt or worse over again. So what do? I think that there are a couple of guys that you could consider. They may be out of left field, and they may be a little bit far-fetched to some, but I do think that one in particular that I'm about to talk about has a very good chance. But first, I'll go into some of these long shot ideas that people have been talking about. And first one I want to get into is Carlos Beltran. Beltran was a very interesting Cardinal figure. We remember him for the 11 run, obviously, and then we remember him as a Met in 2006, striking out against Wainwright. And then we also remember him now as a former Mets manager who was fired after a few hours because of links to the cheating scandal. So the question is where do we draw the line here? And is hiring Carlos Beltran a good thing to do for baseball? Does it respect the character and the game of baseball? And it's hard for me to say. He wasn't just someone who was kind of sitting on the sidelines and cheering people on. He had a pretty important role in enabling the whole system. He was the one who essentially came up with it. So at this point, it's hard for me to accept someone who was that active in what was, quite frankly, the biggest cheating scandal since the Black Sox scandal, the biggest cheating scandal in modern sports. And to associate with that is just not something that, at the end of the day, I would willing to accept. And that's why I do not want Carlos Correa on this team. As great as his production has been, and as much as he may have proven that he can hit without it, if he even is playing without it at this point, there's just it's too late. He is branded. He is a cheater. They cheated, and they were not only they cheat, they got away with it. And that in itself is the greatest slap to the face of the game of baseball, to me. And I will not have, or I will not be happy having anyone associated with that Astros team on the St. Louis Cardinals ever. And that's my stance. I don't believe that this team should be associated with that. And it may seem a little hypocritical for outside fans with the whole scouting hacking thing that happened. But at the end of the day, we're not going to be purposely myopic here. We know that there's a huge difference in degree between trying to sneak into an Astros database with some old passwords and actively conducting an electronic sign stealing system, which is, again, the greatest cheating scandal in baseball history, quite frankly. So that is one name that, as good as it might sound on paper and as good as it might be from an actual baseball perspective, that is, I can't have people associated that deeply with that cheating scandal on the Cardinals and be happy with it. Now, there are other guys who are considered cheaters. Well, I guess one more guy that's considered a cheater that is not necessarily a hot name, but has been thrown out there as a potential. And at the end of the day, could, as a long shot, potentially see. I don't think that they would bring him back, but they have hired him as a coach before, and they have proven that they are willing to bring him on and willing to give him another shot. And they have had success with him in his respective field, and that is Mark McGwire. There's no denying that the team was hitting well with McGwire as the hitting coach, and there's obviously a big red flag with the steroid connotation. But at the end of the day, as bad as steroids are, and as unfortunate it is that the home run record was broken by a steroid user, there is a huge magnitude of difference between taking steroids and electronic sign stealing systems. There's just no ifs, ands, or but about it. The only people who are denying that are Astros fans. And that's just truth. There is a huge difference. And would I necessarily be happy with McGwire coming back? I think he would serve as a pretty good manager. Obviously, the steroid thing is not necessarily the greatest thing in the world. And the fact that he lied about it is, again, not the greatest look. But if we're talking him or Beltran, there's no question that I would take McGwire over him. I think that steroids, while they are cheating and while they are a blatant disregard to a lot of people and a lot of livelihoods and the sport of baseball itself, as unfortunate as it is, it has become ingrained in the culture of sport, or in the culture of baseball, and it's just something that has become a part of it, especially in that time period. It's unfortunate to say, but it was just something that was interwoven within the game at the time. You know what's not interwoven with the game? You know, it's something that was blatant and entirely wrong and was not simply, oh, I'm just trying to compete, or I'm just trying to keep up. I don't need to say it. We all know. So that's my stance on that. Now, going to some more optimistic candidates, some happier notes, some guys that I would be much, much more enthused about. One more long shot again, just a name thrown out there. For the most part, there haven't been a lot of names besides Stubby Marmol and the final guy I will talk about linked to the Cardinals yet. So a lot of the other guys that I'm mentioning are just simply names that I would like to see. But one of them that I would like to see at least be considered I think, is Matt Holliday. Matt Holliday has a couple of guys in his family who are baseball coaches. He obviously was part of the Cardinal system for a long time and was a great Cardinal player. Funny story about Matt Holliday is, for whatever reason, I had trouble watching him home run. It would be one of the situations where when I would watch him, he would never hit it, but I would watch him at bat and then go upstairs and come back down to find out that he had a home run. So even in spite of my jinxing him on the TV, Holliday was a great player, and I know Holliday was a great player, and he was a good fundamental hitter, and he is someone who could probably bring a fresh approach to the Cardinals system. And he doesn't have any experience, but he has, I believe it's his father and his brother are both baseball coaches. So he has at least that secondhand experience and those resources to lie on it, and that experience, again, secondhand experience to really look at. And while that's not necessarily the greatest thing in the world or the biggest qualifier, it does compete with some of these other guys, quite frankly, especially considering that the Cardinals really do need a fresh voice. And while Holliday was very much ingrained in the system and in the Cardinal way, he would bring, I believe, a fresh voice to the dugout. And I believe that while there might be some bumps on the road at the beginning, I think that Matt Holliday would sink into a pretty decent role. Will he be considered? Does he even want the job? I would imagine probably not to both, honestly. But it's just something to consider. And another guy, or I'll kind of do these together because they're sort of the same vein. One is way better than the other, but they are sort of the older guys who are very well established, much outside the organization, though. But again, older guys, experienced guys who would bring a fresh voice and wouldn't have those learning curves and those bumps, and would just simply be able to pick things up and go. There is, on one end, there's Buck Showalter, who would be a pretty decent hire, I'd say. Not the greatest in the world. And the other, who I think would be a much better one, is, if possible, Bruce Bochy. Both guys are really sort of following that win now perspective that the Cardinals are on at this moment, where you want a guy who can really just get moving right away, doesn't necessarily have to go through learning curves and doesn't have to deal with growing pains, and can just get this team going at its highest caliber as quickly as possible. Because the reason they fired Shildt was because they know that the window is small and that they need to win as quickly as possible. And hiring an inexperienced manager and one who still needs to sort of get his bearings at the beginning of a season, that is not the way to do it. That's the way to slow things down. So I think that Bochy is, just generally speaking, a way better manager than Showalter. I think I've seen a lot of Showalter moves. We all remember Ubaldo Jimenez over Britain. We've seen those kind of moves out of him, and that's not necessarily the greatest sign in the world. But a guy like Bruce Bochy has proven success. He's won World Series. He's been a long tenure guy, and you know what? He's proven that he's been a good manager. And I would like, it's another long shot, but that is definitely one of the top guys on my list for sure, Bruce Bochy. Now, finally, I think of the names that I even want to consider, or even think are plausible to consider, the name that I believe is the number one guy on the list, or should be the number one guy on the list, is none other than Skip Schumacher. He's been a associate manager, so a sort of an assistant manager to Kapler in San Diego for a couple years, so he has a little bit of experience. He's been very well regarded as a coach, around that system even before being an associate manager. And he's another guy who is a very fundamental player, solid fundamental hitter. Wasn't necessarily the most talented and got through with playing the game the right way and playing the game hard. And with his experience in San Diego and his time with the Cardinals, I think that's a great fit. And I think that's a guy that they're also going to be looking at. We might end up seeing a little exchange where Skip Schumacher comes to St. Louis and Mike Shildt goes to San Diego. I think that is a very, very possible scenario. In fact, I'm hoping that is what happens. If I am very confident that Mike Shildt will be considered by a lot of teams. I think generally speaking, from what I understand, he's considered around the league as an elite manager. So it's just a matter of time as to when he's going to get picked up. But in terms of the Cardinals, I think that if you're going to want a guy who's ingrained in the Cardinal way, it's not a good idea to look internal. It's a good idea to look at the guys like the Hollidays, like the Maguires, like the, as much as I said I don't want it to happen, as the guys like Beltran who have played with the Cardinals, who understand what the Cardinals are about, but have also acquired a lot of skills, a lot of ideas, and a lot of things from other organizations and other teams and other cultures to introduce and to bring as a fresh perspective to the team to really get them over that hump. Because it's about introducing something. This is what this move is about. It's about bringing something new to the table that allows them to win now. The team concluded that they didn't have what it took to win now, and so they're bringing something new. And so don't rehash the same stuff. Don't get a worse version of Mike Shildt or a less experienced version of Mike Shildt. Get someone with a fresh perspective, fresh ideas, and someone with a little bit of experience, even coaching at the major league level. At the end of the day, Stubby and Marmol they have first base coaching experience, They have very small amount of experience, but when you're looking in comparison to guys like Mark McGwire, guys like Bruce Bochy and Buck Showalter and Skip Schumacher, it just doesn't compare. And if you're going to hire a guy like Stubby or Marmol, then there was no point in firing Mike Shildt because you're just going to get the same stuff. You're going to get the same stuff. And the final point that I want to touch on here is the interesting fact that Jeff Albert and the coaching staff in general was kept intact. Does this mean that the Cardinals are dedicated to the Albert system and that perhaps Shildt tried to go against that, and that is what caused the rift and caused the philosophical differences? That is a possibility, and I think that the narrative around the 17-game win streak and that the way that the mindset sort of changed from the Jeff Albert mindset to the Shildt mindset might have ruffled some feathers perhaps. And the Cardinals are trying to stick to the analytical perspective, and it's not really working, quite frankly. And if that really is the case, then that would be incredibly frustrating. I've mentioned it before. There are guys who certainly benefit from that, but there are other guys like Tommy Edman on our team who really are hampered by the patient metric approach, the walk approach, the OBP approach. There are guys who need to play the game of baseball by feel and swing the bat, and we need a manager who understands those nuances and who can bring both a new analytical and smart perspective with a feel for the game and a feel of baseball. And, as much as La Russa doesn't say follow analytics, it is sort of the feel of the game and the way that he saw matchups that really drove his moves. It's the same sort of vein of idea, where it wasn't necessarily he was looking at a stat sheet, but he understood who did well against who and put those guys in positions to face the guys they did well against. And that's the kind of approach that we need, a balanced approach, and one that's not necessarily as feely as La Russa, but one that can also use analytics as a tool, not just the rule. And that is why I'm not at all a fan of Kevin Cash. I think what he did to Blake Snell is a sham and a disgrace, and I don't even want to get into it, how offended I was as a baseball fan to see that moment taken away from Blake Snell. Kevin Cash is someone that I wouldn't want nowhere near my organization, because if you're going to have Kevin Cash, you might as well just have a computer. And that's not someone we need. We need someone who understands the metrics and understands those things, but can apply them in a baseball way and not just in a numbers way, and can blend the feel of baseball with the modern approach. And that's why a fresh face, a guy like Skip Schumacher, I think, would be the guy that the Cardinals should look for. So I think the biggest thing is, this could be a good move. This can be a very, very good move. This could be the move that we remember as the one that brought them over the top. Similar to the way that we see the trigger to the Warriors dynasty being the hiring of Steve Kerr. Similar to how the Raptors were elevated because of the way that Nick Nurse brought them to another level and brought them fresh ideas and brought them a new perspective. It is up to the Cardinals to try and replicate that type of replacement. And there are guys out there. We've seen a guy like Gabe Kapler come in and be great, truly great. So it is up to the Cardinals to see whether or not they can get out of their shell, stop exclusively looking internally for the Cardinal way, quote unquote, and really start to branch out and look for fresh, new ideas that are good and that can help this team. There are more than one way to approach the game. The Cardinal way, it's a good way, but it's not the only way. And it's time for the St. Louis Cardinals front office to really see that. Thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate it. And let me know on Twitter at STL Unrestricted what you guys think the approach that the Cardinals take in replacing Shildt and the reasoning that is sort of behind their hiring of a new guy. Because if it really is just the same internal stubby clap Marmol replacement, then this was a bad move. But if the Cardinals can really find a guy that takes them over the top with something new, then this can be one of the best moves that John Mozeliak has ever made. Thank you all so much. Let me know what you think. And as always, go Cardinals.